would say thanks the person that introduced him. Isn't it great to be here? Bigger, better than ever before, etc. It sounded a little bit nervous to me.
He did, didn't he? And he's right to be nervous. Of course, he's decided to push back, or that vote on the winter fuel allowance has been pushed back until tomorrow, when he's not even going to be there, flying out to the United Nations in New York. There's some discontent amongst the 5 union leaders that, of course, brought that motion opposing the cut to the winter fuel allowance. It's not been perhaps the celebratory party conference that you would expect for a party returning to power after 14 years, which is, of course, the first time that a Labour Prime Minister has addressed conference since 2009, when, of course, it was Gordon Brown. So, yes, he is nervous, and I think perhaps had there not been the stories that we've seen about Keir Starmer's gifts, spectacles, glasses for passes, of course, with the accusation, levelled at Lord Wahid Ali, a key Labour donor who gave Keir Starmer more than £16,000 for his clothes, paid for his accommodation during the election campaign, and also gifted lent a flat to Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, hosted a birthday party for the Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. All of this has been a backdrop to a party conference for a political leader in Keir Starmer, who said he was coming into politics, as you heard there, to put it, return government to public service, to the service of working people. And the backdrop to this conference has not been ideal for Keir Starmer, given the whole core messaging that we've just heard a bit of there.
Well, I bumped into a guy outside the studio here at Talk just yesterday who, introduced himself to me. He said, hi, listen to the show, etc. He's a union man. And he said, look, what's happened doesn't feel like the party of the working people. The winter fuel allowance, he was apoplectic, couldn't believe that this is what they'd done. Whatever the financial implications, he felt this was a political move. And I think that's, OK, get the bad news out the way early seems to be the word of the sentence of the day. I think that's going to hang around them, though, isn't it? I don't imagine that's ever going to go away in this Parliament.
The problem is that it was clearly a misstep. But actually, if you look back to that original statement by Rachel Reeves, apart from this particular line about this decision around the winter fuel allowance, yes, there was some bad news, but there weren't any political mistakes in there. This was a mistake. And what made it worse was that they didn't correct it very quickly. Yeah. Because had they done so, they could point to the fact that they'd made a mistake. It was they could blame it on the civil servants. They could say they took some dud advice, but they decided actually not to do that. They decided to actually almost make a political point about switching from pensioners, which of course were the focus of George Osborne and David Cameron when they were in Downing Street and the Treasury in Number 10, to working people who, of course, Keir Starmer defines as not being able to write a cheque when they get into trouble. That realignment when, of course, there are not enough resources for everybody, from pensioners to those on low wages, low and middle income wages. But ultimately, for Keir Starmer, pensioners were once working people, and they are on fixed income. And this is a party, he has talked about returning fairness, about bringing in a political party that was more equitable, that was in it for the little man, just as, much more so than Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak were in it for their own vested interests. And he hasn't been able to shake off that particular decision. And of course, then it becomes about his own credibility. It becomes about his own strength as Prime Minister and about Rachel Reeves' strength as the first female Chancellor, because to U-turn now would be seen ultimately as a weakness. Only, fewer than 100 days into their leadership, that actually they have to U-turn on what has become a central plank of their own policy.
Let's look at what happened a little earlier, though. Yvette Cooper, there was lots of talk there about Labour being the party of law and order, knife crime, street crime, whether it was shoplifting, whether it was antisocial behaviour. But one area that I thought was rather interesting, she talked about the right-wingers, Tories and Reform, dubbing them right-wing wreckers. What was she specifically referring to there?
So I think she's trying to box in the Conservative, what's left of the Conservative Party, and reform under Nigel Farage, and trying to box them into, of course, what we saw. This is a political strategy, by the way.
Yeah.
Make no mistake about it. I'm not justifying, I'm just outlining exactly what she's trying to do, right? And she's trying to box them into actually not being on the side of people who would have looked at the riots in Southport and felt actually this isn't the right response. She's trying to portray them as being on the wrong side of the argument when it comes to the violence that we saw across the summer. Now, there are those, Ian, who looked at what happened in the summer and condemned the violence as being unacceptable, as being something that we cannot have, but at the same time wanted to say, actually, there needs to be a broader debate about immigration policy in this country, and about the fact that we're spending, upwards of £6-7 million a day to house asylum seekers in hotels. And I think what Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is trying to do is to put in a dividing line and say, actually, on the other side of the argument, you end up in a situation where the right-wing wreckers, as she put it, are somehow trying to excuse what has happened.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know about Yvette Cooper, but certainly Keir Starmer, when the Black Lives Matter riots happened in the United States and the place was almost burning to the ground in certain towns and cities, there was all sorts of violence, people lost their lives. It was, far greater than anything we saw after Southport. But there were a lot of voices saying, we have to understand the anger. We have to understand what has led people to this. And I suppose using that as a template, it wouldn't be unreasonable. I mean, if you were putting this in a dissertation, you'd be criticised for not mentioning this by your lecturer. If you didn't say, well, there are parallels here. There has to be parallels where some people thought no one's going to justify setting fire to hotels, but stoning police officers, the shoplifting, the looting, all of those people go to hell, go to jail. We all get that. But what happened next almost was a genuine discussion about where people felt we were at in terms specifically of immigration. And some Conservatives, not all, but some took it on. Reform UK took it on. Labour chose to pretty much ignore that in its totality and simply suggest that the whole thing, start to finish, was all about right-wing nutters.
There's a problem for the Labour Party and there's a problem for the leadership when it comes to the immigration conundrum, the migrant conundrum that we are facing at the moment, because we're still seeing, and we had high numbers last week. We've now got more than 25,000 migrants across the Channel this year. It's going to very likely to surpass the total of 29,000 last year. Keir Starmer made a decision, second day of government, to scrap the Rwanda deterrent. He went to Italy, and we had Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister in Italy, saying, well, actually, we're looking to introduce a deterrent with Albania, where we can immediately deport migrants to Albania. Keir Starmer turned around on the stage where Giorgia Meloni was stood next to him and said, actually, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what you did in terms of going to Libya and Tunisia. But then you have Martin Hewitt, who, of course, is his new border commander, saying that we need some sort of deterrent in order to stop people crossing the Channel. Keir Starmer does not see, his view is not the same as those who believe that there needs to be a deterrent in place to stop people spending thousands of pounds or paying thousands of pounds to criminal gangs in order to make that crossing and come to this country in search of ultimately a better life. And he finds himself in a situation where ultimately, if you're listening to those who have worked in northern France and trying to stop the crossings, I'm thinking about people like Kevin Saunders, Tony Smith, who of course work for UK Border Force. I'm thinking of Martin Hewitt, his new Border Force commander, who is saying, actually, you do need to have some sort of deterrent in place in order to stop this happening. And the danger for Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper is that we still have this problem in a year's time. We still have this problem in 2 years' time. And it is a concern for voters, particularly in red wall seats, who entrusted Labour to deliver. And if the vote and the margins, the numbers him were very low. Keir Starmer only got 36% vote share at the last election. And in large part, not in total, but in large part, he won that election on the fact that reform spliced the Conservative vote in half. And that actually, you could end up in a situation, or Keir Starmer could end up in a situation at the time of the next election where there is some sort of accommodation between Nigel Farage and Reform UK and the Conservatives on the other side, led by Robert Jenrick or Kimmy Badenoch or somebody else, where actually they get their act together and form one unifying force to take on Keir Starmer on this particular issue, which he may well not have been able to deal with effectively, and suddenly he becomes a one-term Prime Minister.
Yeah. Absolutely right, and that you'd like to think, if he's sensible, that is rattling around in the back of his head or at the front of his head, or almost on a daily basis. We've seen how quick. It's not as if we haven't seen in recent years how a big majority can be reduced to complete dust. So I'm sure it's there on the agenda somewhere. Listen, Theo, I have to step in for time. Starmer continues. Theo Usherwood, thank you as ever. We will speak very soon. We'll